Very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us this morning for our first CEID event in the World Circular Economy Forum CEID event series. We're going to look at circular business models today, overcoming barriers and unleashing potentials. And my name is Susanne Kartner. I'm head of the Circular Economy Initiative, and I'm going to lead you through this session today. So what are we going to do this morning, the next 1.5 hours? Well, first of all, I'm going to give you a brief insight into what the Circular Economy Initiative is, what we've done over the past 2.5 years. And then Erik Hansen will provide you with an introduction to the report, Circular Business Models. Erik Hansen, he was the co-lead of the working group on circular business models together with Patrick Wiedemann. And both of them will be joined then for the panel discussion by Christian Schiller and Stephen Jameson. Erik, he's head of the Institute for Integrated Quality Design at the Johannes Kepler University in Linz. And Patrick Wiedemann, he's the group CEO of the Reverse Logistics Group. Christian Schiller, he's the co-founder and CEO of Surplus. It's a German startup. It's an online marketplace for plastic recyclers. And Stephen Jameson, he's the global head for circular economy solutions at SAP. And really big thank you to all of you for giving us your time and dedicating your time to join us for the session this morning. But before we start, just a quick recap. Well, of course, most of you will know that the topic of circular economy plays a crucial role in context of the European Green Deal. And it's not only in one specific sector where the circular economy is spelled out, mobilizing industry for a clean and circular economy. In the different sectors, like in the building sectors, in the farm to fork strategies, we find many, many different circular economy levers looking at the potential of reuse, remanufacturing, and recycling. And we are very glad to see this now, to see the attention to circular economy becoming bigger and bigger. When we started our work, we already started in 2019 with the Circular Economy Initiative, when we started looking at the potentials of what it can do. And we were very glad to have 3 ministries on board to accompany our work. Our funding ministry, the Federal Ministry of Education and Research, but also the Ministry for the Environment and for Economic Affairs were present in our steering committee and gave us advice throughout the process. So a big thank you to all of the experts involved as well. But then, of course, it's a circular economy, and we were really happy to have 24 big, important German companies. We had startups on board as well. We had academia accompanying the process as well, 24 institutions, renowned institutes. And of course, it's not a multi-stakeholder dialogue without the support of civil society organizations, of NGOs as well, who were present throughout this entire process. We had 3 content deep dives. Circular business models is the one we're going to look at today, but we also looked at traction batteries and packaging. And what was very important for us when we set up the working groups for these 2 topics as well, that we had the entire value chain sitting there at the table, because it's only with all the relevant stakeholders involved that you really can discuss how the transition to a circular economy can be made possible and how we can develop these so-called circular value networks that we are going to be talking about. The Circular Business Models Working Group, headed by Erik and Patrick, they developed a business model typology, which you will be introduced in a few minutes. And they looked at digital technologies and the regulatory framework conditions as enablers. And it is really this sort of overarching perspectives from the Circular Business Models Working Group that we then also used for developing the Circular Economy Roadmap for Germany, in which we also carried out a macroeconomic analysis looking at the contributions of different circular economy levers to reduce material input, but also greenhouse gas emissions. And then this sort of overarching perspective was then enriched by the perspectives from traction batteries and packaging working groups. And they were really sort of like quite different systems we looked at. Traction batteries very valuable products. Everybody has an interest in keeping them in circles and providing a circular management. And with the packaging, of course, it's far more difficult. Very often we just use it, dispose it, it lands in the environment. And here the incentives need to be completely different. And it's really with these three perspectives combined in the circular economy roadmap that we developed our policy recommendations. If you have an interest in the contents of this roadmap, we're going to have a session, side event session tomorrow morning at the same time. And my colleague, she'll be pasting in the link for registration in the chat right now. And with this, I'm going to be handing over to Erik, who's going to introduce you now to the topic of circular business models. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So Erik, you can
Thank you very much, Susanne. And have a good morning, everybody. Seeing many viewers this morning, and I'm very happy about this attention to our report on circular business models. I'm trying to share the screen here, and I hope this is working. So
perfect.
That's it. Yeah, good morning again. Thank you for the introduction, Susanne. And I'm presenting in the name of my co-lead, Patrick Wiedemann from the industry side, and of course also in the name of all working group participants from industry and from science and from civil society. So our working group and related report on circular business models, overcoming barriers, unleashing potentials, as Susanne already said, had a time of development of about 2 years from the first meeting. It was quite an intensive process, and we are happy to present some of the findings here today. Of course, we have to focus a bit on some of the results because this was an extensive work and the report is also quite long. So we can also we can actually only kind of motivate you to further follow up with our written documents as well. So the members of this working group, Susan before presented the entire Circular Economy Initiative Deutschland with many working groups, or 3 main working groups, and our own working group on circular business models had a share of academics and industry and also civil society organizations, leading institutions and leading industry players, and civil society organizations like WWF, for example. And that is the resources, the intellectual resources and the experience that we included in this working process. The objectives of this working group and the related report was to develop a science-based handbook for the successful implementation of business practices promoting a circular economy. And as the title says, we took a business model perspective here. And yeah, the goals, the sub-goals were actually to better understand or to derive from existing scientific understanding, to derive a working understanding for circular business models and how that helps practitioners to advance in this direction. Second, to also, of course, we know that circular economy doesn't just happen like that automatically, but there are many barriers in the way to that transition. And so we had a look at the barriers, but we also, we didn't want to stop there in the negative, if you will, but really wanted to focus on how to overcome those barriers. And we had 2 enabling factors which we looked at and which we wanted to look at. That was digital enablers and policy enablers. And we also had support here from specialists and also from reviewers from the European Union. I see Helmut Maurer also in the with the viewers. I'm very happy to see that, who supported us as well here, and of course many other people. And finally, as usually with ARCA-Tech projects, it was of course the goal as well to derive some specific recommendations for practice in science. So this is the actual results. We indeed then developed a kind of business model understanding, and in fact I will present this understanding in the next slides. We chose an actor-specific perspective on business models. we kind of systematically organized different barriers which are to be considered when implementing circular business models. We looked into the digital enablers and developed, for instance, a circular product policy framework next to many others detailed policy recommendations which we developed. And yes, we also tried to integrate these different findings using a use case of television, where we showcase the different business model approaches and how digital and policy enablers could actually help to develop the circular television. We had external reviews from the science side and from the policy practitioner side, as I mentioned already before. And as Susan said, the process has been quite extensive, and we already launched the main results we launched already end of 2020. That was actually the point of time where the executive summary of this working group and report was available. But it took some further time until summer last year to finalize this. The focus today will be, we need some selection because it's lots of stuff. And we will deep dive into the business model understanding of this working group, and then relatedly look into these other results. First of all, in this working group, we focused on technical cycling in the circular economy, or what others have said, the performance economy. We don't want to exclude biological cycles, but we considered with regard to generating sustainability impact with the circular economy, we considered biological resources, bio-based resources, just as another input, which should actually then be cycled technically through recycling, refurbishment, etc., in order to really maximize the resource utilization. So that was our focus. Both product and material level focus, specifically in our further conceptual understanding of this working group. We focus, similar to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, we focus on these 4 main technical cycling strategies: on maintenance and repair and upgrading related to that, on the reuse of products, the remanufacturing of products and components, and then on the material level, on recycling practices. Implicitly in this working group, we basically looked at mechanical recycling here. This is now, and that took much time in our working group process. This is now the introduction of our understanding of circular business model as the basis of the further report and our further work in the working group. And we screened, what we did is that we screened the existing knowledge on circular business models. There has been quite a dynamic development in the past years. And our aim was to go a bit further than that what we've found before. So what we did is kind of integrate existing knowledge, and we wanted to develop an understanding of business models where the actor in the value cycle or in the value chain, but then later on we basically talk about value cycles, that the actor's perspective is key, because we wanted to develop also practitioner recommendations, and they can only be practical if we really take the perspective of the individual actor and role in the value cycle. So our first perspective, or the first dimension in our circular business model understanding, was the actual position in the value cycle, from suppliers, producers, and also waste management sector, logistics, etc. The second dimension of circular business models important to us was, of course, the different technical cycles from recycling to maintenance and repair. That was absolutely crucial to us, because in the past we've seen so many work done and being focused all around recycling only, which is, from the waste management hierarchy, considered the lowest impact circular strategy. And it was very important for us, of course, then to consider circular business models as something that goes much beyond recycling. And that's why we put this at the heart of this typology of circular business models. A third important dimension for our understanding was the service degree, and that was a strong discussion and a long discussion, and we sourced in current business practices and of course the evidence from the academic literature, and our result of this discussion procedure was that in order to drive the circular economy and the related business models further, we really need to think much more strongly about services and servitization than before. That's nothing new. We have seen this development in some decades before, but with the circular economy in place, or with the desire to develop a circular economy, this gets a renaissance, if you want. So it's much about whether you offer just products and sell the products in a transactional style on the market, or whether you actually offer services where you are able to care about your products and the product lifetime. So yeah, companies in these more service-oriented business models are incentivized to develop products which have a high uptime instead of just selling a mass of products. Let's go a step further into the details. Taking any actor, the business model understanding here looks like this. You have these different circular strategies from recycling to maintenance, and you have the different service levels from just transactional product sales over use-oriented services, which is, for example, rental and sharing systems or leasing systems, and you have result-oriented services, where, for example, a performance contract. And our assumption in this working group was that by moving from these rather established product-oriented business models to more service-oriented business models, and by moving from more recycling practices to actually product lifetime extension practices like maintenance and remanufacturing and reusing, that this is more radical, needs more radical change, but leads to better circularity, more ambitious circularity, and more sustainable impact. I want to present some examples from this understanding. I said we follow this actor-specific understanding. For example, from the supplier side, I'll present here some business model example. This is taken from Austria. One business model which we conceptualized was the machine or component as new. So this is based on remanufacturing components. SKF, close to Linz in Upper Austria, they have a performance-based business model, SKF rotation for life, where they basically put the remanufactured components into the customer's production site and monitor it, digitally monitor it, and then take them back before they are worn, and then they can remanufacture them, and so generate multiple lifetimes. So the customer does not pay for the bearing here, which you see for the component, but the customer pays a service fee for the performance of the component. You can have the same on the level of the producer. So we're going one step further in the product life, in the value cycle. So producers like this fire truck producer, they follow a product as new business model. So they refurbish these fire trucks, but on the service level, you see that they rather follow a traditional business model. So they still sell the products, they sell the fire trucks, they get the fire truck back, they remanufacture it, and then basically take some fee for doing the remanufacturing and then give it back to the customer. So it's an additional service, if you will, to a classical transactional product sales business model. But still, they follow these advanced circular strategies of remanufacturing. A third example, going a step further in the value cycle, is some third-party service actors delivering, for example, we called it upgrades, spares, and accessories. So they are gap exploiters. They they try to give some service to existing products in the market. Sometimes it's the producer themselves who are following this business model, like in the case of Fairphone or Shift Phones. They offer online shops for repair modules for the smartphone, for example, where you can upgrade or repair your camera or other parts of the smartphone. So these can be either producers themselves or specialized third parties making money out of delivering repair parts. A second part of the typology, because the screen is so small, then goes further in the value cycle. We have retailers, we have repair service providers, logistics providers, etc. And for each of these actors, we developed some service business models. We will look here into the retailer business model just as a last example. This is what we call the one-stop shop. It's a German telco operator, German Telecom. They follow the reuse business model. They offer telecom contracts, but for example, internet DSL contracts, and they deliver the hardware as a rental product. So they follow, for this hardware, they follow a rental business model for a monthly fee. And so what is included, of course, that you give the product back, that it is being repaired or switched to better performance if you need that. That's all integrated in this rental business model and the related service contracts. So what you can see across these patterns of business models along these different actors in the value cycle, that you always have this choice between more traditional product-oriented business models and more servitized business models. A second big aspect which we looked at was then the barriers to actually adopt such business models. So what we've seen, and this typology is based on case studies which we've seen in practice, so that's all in practice already, but usually those are pioneering companies which have a certain differentiation in the market and often intrinsic motivation to follow such circular business models. But the question, of course, is how to diffuse that and scale that generally in the market and in the industry. So we looked at barriers. I don't want to go into all these barriers, but basically what we did is also based on existing understanding is that we kind of integrated these different barrier types and highlighted what you have to look at when implementing these business models. So we have, of course, product service related barriers of implementation. Often this is a product design, for example, that is not fit for a circular business model. For example, non-repairable smartphone is not repairable. We have provider side obstacles and barriers. So that's that your organization is not fit to actually offer such business models because maybe the sales incentives are oriented towards product sales and not towards services and towards product life extension. And you have user side barriers, of course, that you as a user, you don't like this kind of repairing or giving back for recycling. So the take back procedure, you don't contribute to that. So we have these three key barriers, of course, and depending on the business model that you want to adopt, the specific barriers may look different. Of course, there's also general framework conditions and barriers related to the framework conditions, like to the overarching policy framework in a certain country, in Germany, but also in the European Union. And we will talk about the policy enablers to overcome this. Important is when we go back to this typology of circular business models, we usually took this perspective of the focal firm. So in this case, a producer or retailer, but we also already identified for all these business models the most important partnerships that are necessary. For example, for a retailer, in order to offer such rental services and give out these products and take them back and repair them, etc., you need certain partnerships with third-party service providers or so, which are really going to the door of your customer and really doing these services. So there is, of course, usually in the circular business models, you cannot do it yourself, you cannot do it alone. That was a key message. So we adopted this ecosystem framework and this understanding that really the circular business model consists of not only the focal actor who makes this strategy for circularity, but also business model ecosystem with all the partners, and only they together can actually serve and successfully implement a circular business model together with the customer. So collaboration is key, and from collaboration it is just a little step into digitalization, because of course digitalization is probably the biggest driver to enable collaboration. We looked so in one chapter of this report we looked into the digital enablers, and this is based on this inverted pyramid model where we just generally looked into different enablers related to each of the circular strategies. So whether you're following a maintenance approach or reusing or remanufacturing or just focus on recycling, there are different smart enablers or digital enablers that can help you to do that. This is an inverted pyramid because these digital transactions that are necessary actually decrease in frequency. So where we use a product maybe every day and you have some digital interaction monitoring of the product every day, you only occasionally need some maintenance. After some time you will give the product maybe back, it will be reused. Remanufacturing is usually only once before a product is almost worn, and recycling is only at the end of life. So that's why this is an inverted pyramid. And we looked here we looked into the motivation and the potentials digitalization can now deliver for these circular strategies, which are the basis again for the business models. So for smart use, what focal companies actually want is to better understand the use phase. What does a user actually do with the product? In smart maintenance and repair, you actually want to know about the condition of the product and the components and do some preventative maintenance so that the product is not broken. And for reuse and remanufacturing, we've seen company practices where you actually take the product history, the product database, or also data from a dynamic product passport. So you know the history of the product, you take the history, and in order to organize the reuse and the remanufacturing, decide whether it is actually being reusable, whether it needs to be repaired before, what is the price and the value of a reused or remanufactured product. All this information needs some support from the digital history of the product, and that's things that you can achieve by digitalization of the products and related product lifecycle databases. Last but not least, in smart recycling, we saw that this recent move also from the European Union to introduce product passports is important to improve and actually enable high quality recycling at the end of the product life. So if you know better, if there's a specification, what is actually in the product, what components, what materials, and what you have to do, how to disassemble, etc., in a better way, so to get better separated and more homogeneous material fractions, that will enable high quality recycling. So that's a little bit the overview of the digital enablers, and then we went further into the details here, but that's the overview. We then move on and said, yeah, okay, but digitalization alone will probably not help us overcome all the barriers to circular business models. Of course, we looked at the probably more fundamental barriers, which are also in the regulatory system, in the market framework conditions. And so one task force in our working group worked on these policy instruments and policy frameworks and how to adopt it. First of all, here again, following our overall approach, we looked, of course, holistically into these different circular strategies, from maintenance to recycling. Again, we had the feeling when screening the existing studies that there's some overemphasis on policies in the area of recycling, and we saw some weaknesses in better understanding what specific policy enablers and also barriers exist to actually drive these higher level technical cycling strategies like maintenance, reuse, and remanufacturing. Particularly, for example, in the area of remanufacturing, we saw a big void, and people, it seems that scientists and so on didn't really care so much about these higher value circular strategies. So part of our policy toolkit that we developed in this working group was, first of all, to really differentiate between these different circular strategies and really screen the existing policy enablers regarding these strategies. We then, in this kind of matrix strategy, we try to systematically look into these circular strategies and the different types of policy instruments usually known to policymakers or to scientists doing policy consultation studies. So we looked into economic instruments. We looked at regulatory instruments. So economic instrument is some funding, for example, giving some financial incentives to companies to move on. Regulatory instruments is, for example, a new law on product take-back. Standards, non-voluntary standards as a form of not hard law, but the more weaker law, if you will. We have informational instruments and awareness raising measures. So, for example, eco-label initiatives, or just branding, a campaign on an advertisement campaign by the state to facilitate repair, for example. And then we have government procurement, where public universities and other state entities could actually be a leader in adopting the purchasing of more circular products, and particularly business models. For example, how could the local government rather lease a building or lease furniture rather than buying them, maybe? That could be an example. So we developed this policy toolbox and screened the existing evidence, and that was our source of information for developing the final recommendations in the policy area in this working group. And that comes next and last. Here, what are the recommendations that we developed? I cannot go into each of these because it's a massive set of recommendations that we actually developed. What you see here is rather the, let's say, the categories of our recommendations. So we developed recommendations in the area of in the industry responsibility to invest more into experimenting with circular business models. So that's the industry task. They really have to go further here, have to risk more, have to invest more, and have to change more and go into a more leading role, and not wait only for, let's say, regulatory measures. That's one area of recommendations. A second area of recommendations, and that's maybe the most important one, was the true cost pricing and economic incentives. So we really consider that circular business models will not diffuse largely if we don't have a broader shift in the in the regulatory and market frameworks. So it really needs to make business sense to companies to actually invest in circular business models. That means, for example, one key recommendation in here was that we took up the X-Tax initiative from Europe, particularly from the Netherlands, where it is proposed to shift the tax burden from resources, from labor to resources. So labor should be cheaper and less taxes, and everything that is linked to resource consumption should have more taxes. That's a very established principle, and we basically picked it up and further promoted. We also looked into a broader European level circular product policy framework. We will talk about this in the panel after this presentation. So we introduced and recommended some changes there, some more radical changes in how products are taken care of by, for example, manufacturers. Yeah, this is a third area, actually, is establishing coherent policy framework for circular products. That's what I talked just about. A fourth area of recommendation is suggesting specific activity by the state, by the federal and state level actors to support certain standardization activities, harmonization of activities, developing of new standards where it's still necessary, but often it's actually about harmonization, integration, and further development of existing standards. A fifth area is then some specific activities in the area of information awareness and user skills. And a sixth area is then specific recommendations on how the public actors could go ahead by following public procurement for circular products. And a seventh overarching recommendation was actually on either national or better European level to actually establish some form of institutionalized center, or somebody which actually coordinates these different perspectives on circularity from industry, from science, and from civil society, and really tries to evaluate the process in the transition towards the circular economy. Because we felt that many activities, particularly when they are directed at the political the government institutions, it is rather short term. You have the 4 or 5 year frameworks where each government is actually has a security that they are in place and in charge, but we need some overarching steering of the transition process, which goes beyond individual governments. And that was this last recommendation. So yes, as you can see, that these are the overarching recommendations. And if you look into the report, you will see the details of this for each of these categories. That will be interesting to read afterwards, hopefully. And with this, I'd like to end this overview of our process and of the results generated in this working group. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Erik, for giving this overview. You emphasized it a few times. The underlying report is much bigger. There's still a lot more information. And of course, we invite you to have a deeper look into this. With this, I'd like to invite you to the panel discussion. Christian, Patrick, and Stephen. Erik will be your moderator for this session, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion between the 4 of you. For our audience, we'll be collecting questions that you might have for our panel. Please place them in the chat, and we try as best as we can to answer them towards the end of the panel session. So, Erik, I'll hand over to you again in your moderating role, and welcome everybody on the panel.
Thanks, Susan. So, welcome back, and I'm very happy that we have this nice panel here. Thanks again, Christian, Patrick, Stephen, to be with me here and discuss these issues, some of these findings that we had from the report. And you were all deeply involved in this. And so I think we will have a fruitful discussion. And the first thing I'd like to touch on is the actors in the value cycle. And this is somewhat what we started about as well, Patrick. We started this working group and discussing what's the role, what's the responsibilities of the different actors in the value cycle when we want to implement circular business models. So could you, from your opinions, and maybe I start with you, Patrick, as a co-lead of this initiative. We have so many actors in the value cycle which can contribute in some way, but who is in the lead? Who should orchestrate such change towards circular business models and circular business practice? And how could they ensure collaboration, the necessary collaboration to do that? What's your perspective on that as a logistics professional?
Well, thanks, Erik, and good morning, everybody. And yeah, obviously, this was a very interesting discussion around where could it start? And I think it's to the point, and as we said, it's looking at a forward supply chain. Everything is relatively plannable. It's very organized. We know exactly, and we've mapped out in our industrialization, principally in the past 100 years, very much how this is working. And now we're looking at the same challenge to say, well, how could this work in a reverse mechanism then as well, after a usage time of a product, which brings completely new challenges with it. And that's to the point where we said, we think we need a new ecosystem of collaboration between the actors in that setup. Well, who would be the right one to start it? I think it really comes to the point of who is in the best position to connect the dots in an easiest way. And I guess it depends a little bit on what is the product that we're looking at today. So is it really a stronger focus and a business model that will be built around the product as a central element? So like a hardware element that principally is the driving part around which the servitized business element will be built, and you start to change your business models from like, yeah, we sell the hardware, that's our business, into, no, the hardware becomes a tool which is important to deliver a certain service. So from, like we said, for example, from selling light bulbs to coming to sell light in the home and changing in that way. So the light bulb still is an important element as a hardware in there. So I think in these situations, it's the manufacturer who would be in a better position to start that journey and start connecting the dots and evolving the business model, where in other parts it could be stronger business models focused already on like a reuse element, reuse of components, like services around products that are already built up. So where the service element has a stronger focus in it. And then I think a company around this part who has that servitization is in an easier position to start that journey and bring things together. So in a nutshell, as we said, it's a high complexity. I don't think there's a one size fits all into that part. So it's really to be seen specifically around where are we today and where should this business model be taken, and then it's easier to find out who could start the journey. But I think it's all about starting the journey and trying to connect the dots. Key element of all of these business models is collaboration of actors who naturally have not collaborated until today as strongly as we think they need.
And of course, we can see also competition then who's in the lead. So yes, maybe as you said, that was an important point, that if the product is still key to a solution, then that might be the producer. But on the other hand, there might be some other actor in the value cycle who was maybe even first thinking that they could offer some service solutions here and kind of make a competition to the original manufacturer. Stephen, may I ask you, as SAP, you're also in the business of connecting actors traditionally along the value chain, and hopefully more and more along the value cycle. So what's your perspective on that? Who has to take the lead and how to collaborate then?
Yeah, thank you, Erik, and good morning, everybody. I think this is not so much a question of sort of selecting who needs to take the lead, but more a question of, looking at where we collectively need to go to, and recognizing who's going to seize the opportunity, so to speak, who's going to seize the day and drive that transformation in order to get there. It doesn't necessarily need to be a case of each component of the value cycle needs to sort of move forward kind of in lockstep. The likelihood is that mix will be disrupted and will change as these new models come together. So I think it's a question of who are the leaders, who are the people that see the vision. And I don't think you could take any one industry and say, in that industry, it's going to be that, supplier or that producer or manufacturer that's going to be, or category that's going to be the kind of the obvious winner. So I think it's a question of leadership across the ecosystem. I think also what we see, just to kind of pick on an example, in the UK, we see some great action coming about through NGOs such as WRAP, where they inform or bring together voluntary agreements. They bring together policymakers and industry players around a voluntary commitment, and WRAP govern the process. Everybody pays a subscription to WRAP, and they help to kind of bring that community together and really drive the focus on the change that's needed, and drive true transparency across what every actor is doing in taking that forward. So I think there's some good examples of where good collaboration is happening, but I think to sit back and wait for a leader to be picked would be a mistake.
Okay, interesting insights, Christian. I'd like to take you on board and maybe polarize a little bit and say, okay, in your case and your business and what you brought to the table is maybe a result of that people didn't take a lead. No one took a lead, and there's lots of waste, and now you're trying to kind of fix the system and provide some collaboration, ex post collaboration, which wasn't intended and planned maybe in the beginning. I'm not sure whether I polarized too much, but maybe that's your entry ticket here to the panel.
Thanks, Erik, and thanks for having me. Yeah, sure, I'd love to polarize. I'm going to give you a very clear answer. The leaders should be entrepreneurs and startups who do not have a vested interest in the linear economy, because I do not believe that value chain actors that still today have an interest in business models that somewhat operate under linear business models have an easy time connecting these dots, as we say, by then positioning themselves as, now we're reinventing ourselves as, let's say, plastic manufacturer, or we're reinventing ourselves as a converter. I think they will struggle inside their organizations, as we see, to really enact that change that is necessary and credible and authentic to become a real circular business model leader, as long as it's related to connecting players across value chains. What Patrick alluded to was, sure, there can be leaders within enterprises and within organizations where you manage also this most important factor, which is trust and data supremacy, I would say. Because I do see in our everyday work where we try to connect the players, one of the biggest challenges for players within the value cycle to do what we're doing, that is to connect the buyers and sellers of recycled plastics, is the trust and data supremacy. It is, for all the talk about, yes, we need to change and we need to be more sustainable, once you get to the point and say, all right, then can you share the formula of your plastics in your products to the next step in the value chain? And then Chinese walls go up and say, yeah, well, we need some secure technology that makes sure that nobody knows from our market competitors about this, right? And this is also why I actually see companies really struggling with platform models from the existing value chains that are in the value chain. And I can tell you, Erik, it has happened, and it is happening, that companies within the value chain trying to replicate what we're doing, but they will always come to the point, okay, so why should I trust as a competitor to, let's say, plastic manufacturer A, why should I trust now this platform operated by them, that they will be independently guiding us through this circular change and not keep their own company interest at first and foremost at their heart. You know, this is the world of shareholder values that we're living in. So long story short, I polarize and I say it needs to be maybe not a startup, but maybe not, you know, this is of course a bit selfishly arguing here, but two conditions must be met. And I think you must have independence from linear business models, number one. And ideally you have a business interest that is purely in circular business models, that you don't make money still from kind of dabbing your feet in linear business models. And if these conditions are met, maybe that can be a government actor, maybe that can be someone else. But if I just see actors that don't fulfill these two conditions struggle in the circular economy.
Thanks for these insights, Christian. I think you touched upon many interesting points, particularly also which is going a little bit beyond our working group, but also these issues of intellectual property and data sharing, and where there are actually new practices emerging, like trusteeing of product formulas by third party actors, etc., which are maybe have new responsibilities, which could also be state level actors in the future who have some neutral parties. Yeah, I fully agree with what you all said. Basically, Patrick, I think it was very important, this insight that depending on the actual business, it might be a different actor who's taking the lead. Christian, I think it's absolutely important that we have independent actors, not with vested interest, because they are probably better in driving these business models. So that's, I think together it's really nice combination and insights into the actor perspective. And you touched already upon some of you, particularly Patrick and Stephen, you touched upon the servitization perspective, and that was key to our working group. So we really, and part of this business model typology that we propose as a basis of the report, we basically say some normative move almost, that we need to get away from the pure product sales transaction business and need to think much more about services now from a producer or a supplier perspective, etc. Whether it is molecules that you rent out molecules, or whether it is components, or whether it is performance contracts for products. It doesn't matter which actor in the supply chain, but that becomes important because it will enable circularity. But obviously, we've seen very few of these servitized business models in practice. We see pioneering companies showcasing that in the machine building sector, partly in the mud jeans, like jeans for lease, partly in the business to consumer area, but only very few. So I would like to know and discuss a bit with you, what can we do? Is it realistic, this servitization perspective, going from product sales to more rental, leasing, performance contracting, what Walter Stahl basically called the performance economy? Is that realistic? What holds us back, or how could we drive this transition further? Who says here? Who has to say something about this?
I don't mind.
Stephen, please.
Going first, why not? So, and it's such an interesting topic, servitization at SAP, because we've been going through our own transition from selling products that are on-premise to selling products that are service-based over the last decade or so, I guess now. So we feel the reality of such transition here at SAP, and also the great opportunity that moving towards service-based business models presents, certainly in an organisation like ours. I think we've got to start with the macro context, right? People, consumers, policy, the big kind of building blocks, finance, and at the base of this, whether we're talking about a pair of jeans or whether talking about the latest car, ultimately we've got to get to grips with materials, the core materials that make up products, really getting that kind of alignment between people and policy and investor providers and businesses, in order to be able to have a kind of common language around the impact of materials and the knowledge of what it actually takes to create a pair of jeans for a one-off use, or indeed, you know, heavy industrial asset. And so I think with that greater sharing of insight on materials in terms of ultimate land use impact and the biodiversity impacts and so on and so forth, we can start to increase the level of dialogue, the level of interaction between consumers and brands, and also start to optimize the measures that policymakers are able to take in terms of the role they'll play in terms of incentivizing such a model. It is clear that it is a kind of combination of interventions across each of those kind of key building blocks, which takes us there. You know, I think in certain fewer cases, perhaps it will be a pure financially driven motive in terms of, you know, new opportunity. That's certainly the case in the software industry, for example, but we don't necessarily move much in terms of physical materials. But those that, you know, want to put clothes on people every single day, you know, I think there is a, you know, clear willingness in the kind of consumer base for more sustainable fashion. The fashion industry is saying so. But to actually get into the nitty-gritty of, okay, what constitutes a more sustainable garment, for example, versus a less sustainable one, is something that you know could be debated forever. And so I think the more that we can drive clarity in terms of the real costs and the real implications of different choices, the more that, you know, the value of service-based business models, you know, jeans as a service, for example, will become relevant. And ultimately, the simpler that proposition is for the consumer, the faster the shift will be. And that's where it will ultimately be driven from at the end of the day. We can legislate so much, we can manage so much within a context of a particular jurisdiction, but ultimately, when we can drop ship something from China, there's always going to be a backdoor somewhere that we need to be able to manage. So having that kind of holistic approach across those big spheres of people, policy, investors, and business is going to be critical.
Patrick, what's your perspective on that? I think you're probably having some kind of business as well with, for example, manufacturers or so, which have either traditional product sales business models, but maybe even also shift to more service business models where you also have more need probably for logistic operations to be conducted. What's your perspective?
No, and I can also just emphasize on what Stephen just said around, you need to get to a more holistic view on this again. We're talking about, and there I agree also with what Christian said before, to the point we need to reinvent the way we are acting together in that setup. We need to break out of that very linear structure that has been built up into that part. And the more people have invested interest, the more difficult it becomes for them. So this servitization really is completely rethinking, how do I work with my customer out there at the very end? What's my relation with my customer? A lot of producers today even struggle to know their customers really in that way. It's because they don't have a direct touch point. So it's really to the way of like how does that whole connection change? And then we look at successful models that are established in the B2B area. Most of them were driven to either deliver a higher value through higher convenience, through easier use of products, through various improvements that I get versus just buying a product, owning it then as the user and using it in that part. Just the example of like nobody in the B2B world today would ever buy a copy and scanner machine anymore. These are all lease business models, because to the point that it is a holistic approach in that connection. All that I want is to be able to copy and scan with that machine. So I'm willing to pay per use, because for me as a user, it's a much more efficient mechanism do all of this. So I'm getting a financial benefit out of it. The owner of the machines has the ability to reuse machines, reuse components of the machines. So through that, the material being used in that whole thing and captured just gets used much more efficiently. And that's all that we want. We don't want to destroy resources on the one hand, but we want to look continuously throughout the usage cycle of how can we drive a much higher efficiency out of the material products that we have in hand. And as I said, this B2B business model delivers all of that. I think the key question of why don't we translate something like this easy into the consumer world are the elements and challenges around, well, ownership of the product, so the legal title on the product to be resolved. If I don't sell it anymore, I still own it, but how can I ensure that I still have control over my product? And this is when we come to then digitalizations and things we will talk about later again, also about how do we overcome exactly those barriers. Regulatory elements are one out of this, but as said, how do I build that framework that I can bring such a new business model to life is a key element and the key answer that we need, sorry, key question that we need to find an answer for. But the B2B world has shown it works successfully. And the only difference is that I have a better and easier control commercially over my product in the B2B world. And I think that's the small click, which is a big hurdle, as we all understand, to bring that into the consumer world in a similar way. And through this, then enable to really act very differently with your customer out there.
Patrick, you developed, you built a bridge to digitalization. So maybe we should walk across this bridge. And you said that digitalization could be one of those enablers to bring this to diffuse this, to scale this, and also bring this from business to business to business to consumer. How could the manufacturer still keep control over products when there are thousands of products out there in the market of a business to consumer market, and you still you sold the product, you're still owner of the product, you need to control them. As an example of digital potentials. Christian, where do you see, as you're coming from a digital startup of digital collaboration platform for exchanging waste plastic, or not waste plastic, but plastic resources, of course, to bring them back in the cycles. You are probably our digitalization expert next to Stephen. So where do you see the strongest potentials now of digitalization in this move towards circular business models?
In abstract term, there where the human brain reaches its capacity to calculate and do the work him or herself. And I give you an easy example. You know, yes, especially in the plastic recycling space, right? If you think about building scalable business models, and this is recycling, but the same would go to remanufacturing, refurbishing. If you think about, we distribute products into the hands of billions of consumers, right? And all these brands in the world do this, and they're kind of upstream, downstream supply chain. That's what they can control, because they know where the crude oil is coming from. They know into which refinery the crude oil is going to turn into plastics, so they can purchase and exactly know what kind of virgin pipeline is looking like, right? But now you send it to the retailers, and then the retailers distribute it into the market. Now you have these products in the hands of billions of people, literally. Even if you have the strongest then procurement, remanufacturing, refurbishing team inside your in-house, let's say let's call it for a big company, BASF in Germany, you all know them. How can you manage these billions of separate then consume patterns and cycles and decisions to then kind of get the products back, or to then kind of build the reliable supply chains about these used products already? That's almost impossible, because I always like to compare that, you know, arguably in the recycling world. On the virgin side, you only have the oil and gas. You need to understand from which well can I use it to go into which refinery to produce what kind of virgin. In the waste world, I mean, every one of us is a producer of plastic waste, right? Every day. And the composition of that changes. While we know kind of exactly what the city of Hamburg is producing in terms of waste every day, in terms of quantity, the quality is changing every day, every second actually. And that makes it so hard even for the best managers of waste that are just moving the quantities around to understand, do I sit here on a pile of gold or, excuse my language, on a pile of crap, yeah, today, yeah? It's not like we don't put enough plastic on the market to reuse it or recycle it. It's just that we are so discoordinated and no human brain can really oversee these product flows simultaneously. So I think in that sense, it's a real digital is the real catalyst, the core point that can connect these material flows if, and that's a very big if all players are then kind of willing to make it transparent where these materials are going. If nobody is willing to do that, well, then you can have the best digital technology, and people talk about blockchain, etc. And I always smile and I think, yeah, you know, you can talk about blockchain all day, but we haven't even mastered yet this Grundlagendigitalisierung, what I call it, you know, the foundation of digitization, the very basic principles of knowing who is doing what when. You don't need to talk about smart contracts when we don't even get to that point. But in that example, I hope I made it clear how fundamental I believe digitization is to circular business model. If we don't manage digitizing the ground infrastructure at every point, and that includes, yes, the consumers, GDPR says hello, then we will not, I don't think we will be able to really build scalable business models in the circular economy.
I like the idea, of course, or the condition that this better control of the products, product pools, and then the take back needs, that this needs transparency as well, as you said, transparency. What is being done with that once it's taken back? I remember still some brands, at least in the past, they were very good in returning every product because they were actually interested in destroying a second market of the products, and everything they did was, after successfully taking these things back, they just crushed it so that it cannot be sold in a second market anymore. So not really circular in a holistic sense. So it needs some transparency where it gets as well. But Stephen, I would like to turn this to you. What is SAP doing for manufacturers, retailers, and other organizations which are interested in better controlling, better knowing about their product fleets out there somewhere in the country and across the world? What are you doing to give those organizations better capabilities to know about and to actually do actions to return products and to do something with that then, like remanufacturing, recycling, etc.?
Yeah, so I think really there's three kind of key spheres of activity here. You know, firstly, there's the kind of the corporate and performance sphere, which is, you know, major enterprise, you know, global operations needs to be able to run its P&L at the same time as sort of delivering upon its sustainability commitments. And you know, clearly all of the topics we've discussed today, you know, that's absolutely not for the faint-hearted. Being able to understand the ultimate land use impact of every, you know, loaf of bread, or, you know, every can of fizzy drink that you put onto the market is a significant challenge. But it's one that, you know, certainly I've been impressed with the sort of the level of urgency and scale at which, you know, producers are really taking this on now. But I guess the key thing there is how you integrate those sort of pre-financial aspects around, you know, the ultimate land use impact of particular materials into the financial close at the end of the day, and how to drive accountability throughout the organization in order to be able to deliver that at the same time as sort of staying compliant, and having a kind of effective conversation with NGOs and policymakers about, you know, what instruments, what measures actually work best, you know, when tackling a global operation. The second element is what I described as sort of the network element. So it's, and you know, I think we just sort of touched on some of those. How do you ultimately meet this massive supply and demand challenge? Was it 101 billion tons of materials we're producing each year, 9% of which is being recycled? Was it 8% now? It's gone down a bit. And you know, ultimately we have this huge delta which needs to be addressed in terms of how to match sources of supply with sources of demand. And in the context of, I think it's 61% of the world 4.9 billion people that don't even have access to waste management infrastructure. So how do we provide the transparency to create the interventions and the infrastructure that actually addresses that? So I think that's point 2. The point 3, actually really interesting conversation where there's an initiative a little bit like this. I'm having a conversation with some of the folks in the UK government recently, and they were talking about the need for a new data ecology, which I thought was quite nice. The sort of the idea that all materials, all products need to be able to sort of tell their own story, and the individual items themselves need to be able to sort of produce data that helps all of these different actors to be able to sort of piece together the pieces and really do the things I talked about in the kind of the first 2 spheres. So this is sort of where sort of good sort of overview of where we're tackling this with SAP, bringing solutions to the market now that kind of make that sort of process more digestible, more actionable at a business level. Yeah, it's a very key focus certainly for us, and a key kind of strategic topic for us in the years ahead, and a very central theme for everything that we're doing, in our overall strategy for how we're delivering solutions to market.
So what I also understand from just observing the markets is that that's something that has been quite separate and separate movements in the area of product lifecycle management, software packages, etc. That this is also something that is more and more has been taken up more and more from an SAP perspective, right? That this is something that needs to be part of the capabilities, software capabilities of an organization, right?
Absolutely, bringing together materials, logistics, and finance. It's sort of certainly a challenge we enjoy.
we have one question from the forum. I'd like to take this in here at this point. One user, Felix, asks in what way there is these negative side effects of digitalization by having more sensors and more digital products, consuming energy and more electronic waste, etc., and whether we have considered that. So first of all, as a disclaimer, that's something we of course thought about and discussed about in the process, and from our circular business model working group perspective, we kind of excluded this discourse in our work. So we considered our task more to look into the potentials. What are the potentials and how could it enable circularity, by of course knowing and acknowledging that it has negative side impacts. But we felt that there are other studies, etc., underway which take a dedicated look at those negative consequences of e-waste and more energy consumption, etc. But maybe still one of you would like to answer, Felix, as well. Well,
go for it.
This is an interesting question because in my previous life, I worked at a startup called BlaBlaCar. It's a ride-sharing service, pretty big, and there was also the servitization thinking around access. Mobility as a service was a thought, and we had that exact question because what I think we didn't discuss in our initiative here was, through servitization, usually the value proposition is that you make the, let's say, access to the commodity or the service cheaper than fully buying it, right? And that we discussed this under a rebound effect. That's saying, in our example, would people travel more on the road? Would more cars be put on the road? Yes, more efficiently, but ultimately still we would be emitting more CO2 because through making it more affordable for car drivers to drive around because they can offset the costs of the petrol on multiple shoulders by sharing it, would ultimately we emit actually more CO2 than before. Yes, we would enable more people to travel, great for society, let's say, but for the planet, maybe not net positive because we are emitting more CO2. And I think that is a valid question, and not so much from the digitization point of view, where I think that's always discussed around the blockchain and the mining taking up lots of resources, and I think that can and could potentially be overcome by a switch to more renewable energy production overall. But I think what we haven't looked at is, would a more servitization of access to commodity and services in the circular economy space, would that lead actually to more consumption overall? Yes, more efficiently, but more. And is that something that's really aligned with the planetary boundaries. So that's a big question mark for myself, Felix, because in the end, in a way, I want to price the products right so that we do even get, yes, in certain materials, services, products where the planet can only offer so much, we do get at some point to a prohibitively high price so that humans change behavior, because that's what they do when prices get too high. So Erik, maybe that is something for a follow-on. I find it super fascinating, that question, but yeah, I think
thanks.
Needs to be looked at more closely.
Thanks, Felix and Christian, for this elaboration. And I think, yeah, it's maybe a weakness even of our group for reasons of time constraints as well, that we didn't really look in more specifically into rebounds effects of circularity per se. There's also publications coming out looking at the circular rebound effect, not only the efficiency rebound effect, but also circular rebound effect. So there's some critique on that. So we shouldn't be naive on the rebounds effect of actually digitalization processes and products. And that is something still to be done or to be seen in other sources. I'd like to
add one thing to that quickly, because I think it's important.
Okay, very quickly, because we have move on to the last.
Just to mention one thing. So it is, I believe, down to us, technology producers, to deal with this. We as SAP have just accelerated our Scope 3 net zero commitment from 2050 to 2030, because we believe we should be taking this on, and we'll be addressing that across the full scope of our value chain in terms of technology and the services that we deliver. And I know other vendors are doing similarly ambitious things. So it is down to us to take responsibility for it, I believe.
Thanks, Stephen. I'd like to move on to the last part of the policy space, as this has been so important to the circular economy movement and also to our working group. And probably there's a very big construction yard here, and lots of responsibilities for state level, national and European policymakers, and all those who contribute to that. And one key recommendation and insight of our working group, also I have to highlight again, also by contributions by Helmut Maurer. Yeah, we're very thankful. Many of our insights kind of cumulated in an idea of a circular product policy framework. We kind of saw that there are some existing policy regimes in place which try to advance the circular economy, like particularly extended producer responsibility. EPR principles have some decades in place. But they didn't get us into the circular economy. They maybe got us into some recycling economy, but not even that, I would say. So what is just to highlight that, what is the principle of the extended producer responsibility? I think, and I polarize a little bit again, it seems to me that this is just a financial obligation to pay. A company, a manufacturer has to pay in order that the waste gets treated somewhere. So as a manufacturer, still, I don't really care much about my waste and my products and my waste. I just pay something. So it's a little bit like church going thing in the past, where you pay to have a good consciousness. We have to move on from this rather financial aspect to get rid of the responsibility to some real responsibility, which we then call the producer responsibility for sustainability, or even more, the producer responsible for the product life cycle, so that producers or retailers actually take care of the products and maintain them, take them back, repair them, remanufacturing them, etc. So that's part of the circular product policy framework, which we thought we would need on the European level. So I think that's quite radical in a way, and I'd like to get Patrick and the others. I'd like to get your ideas of that. How important is that? How radical is that? How realistic is that to get some better responsibility for product care throughout the entire life cycle?
I think, Erik, to the point, we have here again something that happens many times, especially when the complexity just gets very high. We start thinking in silos, organizing things in silos, and trying to solve problems in a limited area and not with an end-to-end view, which is exactly what we see in all the regulations happening today, which even leads to the point that we have conflicting regulations. It's dispersed, even an EPR and so on looks in every country in Europe different. We've got an EU directive on e-waste, but every country did its own thing. So not only from how operationally this should be solved in the country, but also to the point of how the regulation is embedded into country laws and stuff, which drives a huge complexity, first of all, for all the producers, how to manage this. But at the same time, again, we end up with only some certain silo optimizations that might not even be optimal at all. And we're missing that bigger picture. And I think that has become clear out of the work that we did, but also the discussion that we just had in the past 35 minutes, that circular business models have just a much bigger complexity in its whole setup than anything that we've been doing in the linear economy today. And we need to find ways of how to make that manageable. That's why data digitalization and all of this is for me a key element to make it manageable for us. But as I said, regulation also needs to, where we said that radical approach of saying, well, instead of trying to optimize regulation step by step, a little here and a little there, to really say, well, why don't we take it all away, take a holistic look at it and say circular economy itself needs a new framework, also from a legislative perspective, to build a foundation that will allow transition processes that we're looking for to also happen. Because I said, even today, if you would want to transition in certain areas, you might run into a lot of barriers out of legislation that is in place and prohibits you from moving along and just getting this done finally in the setup. And one more word to EPR. And I fully agree with you to the point it has become much more just a financial mechanism to principally the socialized waste management cost to be partially being privatized and being put back on the producers. How successful these mechanisms have been is different, but in the other way, it definitely has led to some change. So I don't want to see it too negative. I think we have also succeeded in a lot of areas to take more responsible care of an end-of-life situation and of a product and how to treat it properly, also from an environmental perspective and so on. Resource recovery, we're by far not where we want to get. But again, the fundamental problem of EPR is that while the idea of extending the producer responsibility beyond the usage time of a product as a principle was okay, but the disconnect that still physically is there, where a producer just simply says, well, I sold my product, it went through a distribution channel, a retail channel, whatever, I got no idea where my product really is, I can't even get a hold of it anymore. This limits it then and principally brings it back to just the financial element of paying for somebody who is acting on the other side of the fence. And principally, it's not just a fence, it's like a wall, and I don't even see a lot of what's going on behind the wall. We only have small holes in the wall where you can sneak peek a little bit through it. But for a producer, it's still that barrier there. And that's exactly to the point of where I think circular business models need to help us to break down these walls and have the ability to have access to your products at a later point and get the benefits out of it and not just make it a financial obligation. And this would radically start to move things. But coming back to policy, I think that radical approach will be a very difficult one in reality. At the same time, I think if we don't come with a radical approach, we also will not get to where we need to get to. We need to disrupt policy.
Yeah, just as a sort of like from the question that was posted in the chat and from what you've just described, it's reducing this complexity and, you know, for the producer to know where are his things, which state are in. Beate Kummer posted the question, which role will a digital product passport play? And I think this goes exactly in the direction that you just described for increasing this transparency for the producer or the owner of the product, right?
it's a fundamental role, but it's just one bit of and piece that we need, but it's a very important one. I agree. That's something as a starting base, the foundation that Christian was talking about before of data. I think a product passport will be a very elemental thing that we need to introduce. Yeah,
we highlighted this as well, yeah, in the report in many of the chapters, and also put this as part of the of this circular product policy framework. We basically requested a passport to be part of this. So I think Patrick gave us a very good motto here to conclude this panel, that we have to, like a 1989 type of breaking down the walls to better collaborate, breaking down the walls for more circularity, to collaborate across the value cycle, and actually take much more responsibility. Each actor in the value cycle take much more responsibility, not only financially, but actual responsibility for those materials, products, and components which are being introduced into these cycles. And then I think we can have some optimism that there is better solutions to come, and more scaling of these circular solutions which we have already seen in the past. So thank you very much for discussing with me on this panel. And Susan, I think the questions which have appeared in the chat we already took up on the way. So I give back to you, Susan, and I'm happy to see the session to be concluded then.
Yeah, thank you all for this discussion. It was really interesting, and yeah, looking at the number of our participants, I think we provided some new insights and details. So thank you all very much for that. Well, we talked about different things. We've learned about the different business model types. We've heard about the barriers for producers, for users, for in the framework. We talked about digital enablers, how they can support this transition, but also about the shortcomings they may come along with, you know, the environmental impact that they have themselves. We talked about, yeah, the new collaboration, the new networks that are to be established. Where do the leaders come from? There were different ideas. Who can be leaders in this new network from within in the companies, but also sort of like from the different actors that are going to be established. So interesting things we talked about. Where do we go forward? Well, just from the discussion here, we know there's a lot that needs to be discussed. Rebound effects was one of the points that were mentioned. Certainly, the metrics question is one that we will take up in our future work. Scope 3 in that context was just mentioned. How do we measure true progress towards a circular economy? On which level do we measure this? On the business level, on the product level, on the national level, these are some of the questions we could not address so far, but they're crucially important if we want to make this concrete. What does a circular economy mean? And then, of course, the whole business model question. We are currently setting up a project in order to break down all these insights you've gained today on the different business model patterns into more tangible product. We're going to develop a business model card deck. So this information and this knowledge that was brought together can be used in businesses if they want to orient themselves and want to learn about which potentials would come for them if they want to settle on new circular business models. So that's some of the work we do. You all do a lot of work as well, and we really, take great pleasure and joy that we come together in these sessions and share our information, share the knowledge. Post other reports on stuff that we haven't managed to work on. But this is the type of collaboration I think that we need. So thank you all. Have a good day, and maybe see some of you for our other session tomorrow. Bye-bye.